Before this video starts, I want to say that during the gameplay recording process, my Xbox One, which I have used for YouTube videos since the Banjo-Kazooie video and occasional Twitch streams, is dead. I'm putting this out there now because throughout the review, you may see a degradation in quality such as performance issues, especially in the pre-rendered cutscenes, as the rest of the gameplay was recorded on an aging Xbox 360. This goes for certain gameplay footage you'll see from other games, as some were either recorded on a PC or through other means. As ridiculous as it sounds, because at the end of the day, it's just a plastic box, this video is dedicated to the fallen. Gone, but not forgotten. It's humorous how I started this video with death, because it comes in many forms. Loved ones no longer among the living, machinery breaking down to an unfixable state, and for the point I'm trying to make, loss of respect and admiration for leaders of entertainment media. You know that saying, you betrayed our trust, you're dead to us now. For the Halo series, it was Halo 4 that was the nail in the coffin for most veterans. For Blizzard, it was the lack of quality and treatment of their employees, among other things. How about the massive Final Fantasy franchise? With such a huge history and a list of countless games from mainline titles to spin-offs, there is a debate to be had about which game is the starting point of Final Fantasy's downfall. But based on reviews and fan reception, most point to Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels as the scapegoat. I don't know about that statement. They're far from perfect games like those before and after. But the worst? I find that hard to believe after playing the first two games. Throughout the series of videos I've done, I have nothing but respect for what the developers were trying to accomplish. They're not objectively good games, but there is entertainment value to be found in different aspects of the first two games. Final Fantasy XIII had top-notch presentation for the time, and the mythos established in the game world is intriguing, but was held back by the linear gameplay and puzzling story decisions from the writers. Meanwhile, 13.2 sought out to refine the gameplay found in its predecessor, and has succeeded in my eyes. While the same level of praise cannot be said to its presentation and story, I'd argue that the priority for 13.2 is making the game fun to play, and the developers achieved it. Needless to say, I was curious how this entire 13 saga will conclude. Will they end with a bang, or a whimper? All I can say is, I hope the developers learn from mistakes made in the past, and create the best game in the 13 series. Nearly everything that's been said about Lightning Returns, I've heard it all before. This is the worst game in the trilogy. This is an insult to the entire franchise, etc. Let's make one thing clear. After playing and reviewing 13 and 13.2, I've already come to expect some level of disappointment from Lightning Returns. Even the best of the trilogy, in my opinion, had some faults that were arguably stronger than the first game. For this reason, I am only going to judge the game based on its own merits, refer to the first two games extensively, and only refer to other non-Final Fantasy games when deemed appropriate. Unlike the first two games, I will approach Lightning Returns as someone who has played it for the first time. The only form of interaction I made prior is through a demo I played roughly 7 years ago, so enough time has passed to treat this as a fresh playthrough. After what felt like an eternity of playing these three games back to back, it's time to close the book with the final game in the 13 series. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII is the final game in the 13 trilogy and is considered by many to be the worst of the trilogy. Reviewers expressed disappointment and bewilderment in the final chapter of the sub-series. Fans were even less forgiving for the final entry. If Final Fantasy XIII is the fabled black sheep of the Final Fantasy franchise, then Lightning Returns is the bastard child of not only the 13 series, but of the entire franchise. However, saying it is one thing, seeing and playing it for yourself is a different experience altogether. And what I played after 45 hours of playtime, actually it's 80 hours but I'll explain why later, can only be described as a roller coaster of emotions, for better or worse. With all that said, let's... While I have a segment dedicated to presentation in my videos, it doesn't necessarily mean that graphics are the only element that matters. It's a combination of style, visuals, and artistic intent. Take Banjo-Kazooie, a game that is approaching 25 years old, and State of Decay 2 as examples. The former has a graphical style that, for most people, stand the test of time, while the latter isn't going for realism compared to its contemporaries, but has a style that is meant to capture the dreary atmosphere of a zombie apocalypse. I cannot stress enough that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. With that said, it's made painfully obvious from the get-go that the graphics in Lightning Returns are a major downgrade from the previous two titles. You don't have to look too far to see how much of its graphical quality has descended. You can walk over to this location after the first battle finishes and take a look outside to see for yourself. Whew, not a good first impression. This game came out at a time when the 8th generation started, even though this game is only available for 7th gen consoles. I'm not going to hold Lightning Returns' visual and performance to the standards of the former, because it would be unfair. But when considering how other developers managed to create and port their games in 2005 hardware with little compromise, I'm sorry, but this is just pathetic. Here, the developers aren't even trying to hide their imperfections, as environmental textures appear blown out of proportion, and the animals are just... just look at this.
Clove? Clove, is that really you?
To understand why this is a big deal, this is what an animal looks like in Grand Theft Auto V, a game that was released a few months prior to Lightning Returns. You know what's more embarrassing though? It doesn't take a keen eye to see where certain textures were cut on this ground. What happened here? Were the developers asleep? Or perhaps traveling through time in the last game became so destructive it created a noticeable permanent mark on the ground. At least I tried to make up a story relevant reason because no one else even bothered. But let's try to be rational here. 13's visuals are a hard act to follow up. Even 13.2 had some level of trouble to meet that standard when reusing assets, all while limiting the game size to 7 gigs maximum. Lightning Returns not only had to make unique worlds, but had to do so with newly created assets in a time frame that's just as long, if not shorter, than 13.2 in order to close out the 7th gen on time. For perspective, 13's development time, excluding the 7th gen transition from 6th gen, is likely 4 years minimum, and the work shows. It's unrealistic to expect the developers to create new assets and have it look good in less than 2 years. How do I know this? It's been said development for Lightning Returns started right after the release of the Requiem of the Goddess DLC for 13.2, which is May 2012. That means, to make the entirety of Lightning Returns, the dev team only had a year and 7 months to make a game and release it in Japan by December 2013. Contrary to popular belief, that's not enough time to create a game, let alone an RPG of this scale. Not only that, this is the 3rd game in the sub-series where it isn't seen as profitable given the reputation of the trilogy. While I don't have proof, there is a possibility that the budget for making Lightning Returns wasn't as large as 13.2 and possibly less than half of the budget the first game had, so corners had to be cut. I'm certain of this because both 13.2 and Lightning Returns, while related to Final Fantasy XIII, aren't mainline titles. They're sub-series titles that don't warrant a bigger budget like 13. As a heads up, if I sound like I'm more forgiving of this game's faults from here on out, just know that this is more or less the reason. Oh, but Opez! Other games in this generation, like the Call of Duty franchise, managed to hold up better than its contemporaries in about as much or less than Lightning Returns' budget and dev time. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna take that argument, put it in this folder, and save it for a different section. Don't worry, it'll come back. What I will say though is, when the visuals come together, it works in its favor. Unlike 13.2, Lightning Returns' world count is reduced to only 4 open world-ish levels: Luxurion, Yuznan, the Wildlands, and the Dead Dunes. There may be some design similarities like how the Wildlands is similar to the Arcalt Steppe or the Dead Dunes to the Dying World, but as far as blatant rips from previous games, there are no traces of that anywhere. My favorite among them is the Wildlands, as it features distinct biomes such as lush forests, open fields, plateaus, a crash site, and ruins. One could argue that this is just the Arcalt Steppe and Yasha's Massif, but scaled down. but I believe the opposite is true. This is what both locations were trying to be. It doesn't have the beauty of 13's graphics, but it makes up for it with a variety of locations set in the last remnants of the world that once was. Both Luxurion and Yuznan aren't that different from each other, but I don't know. Something about these cities feel distinct from each other. Maybe this guy can give me an answer.
Let me sing a song to you, gracious Savior of our soul.
Or perhaps this guy over here.
Rest inside my mind since the day you came.
Or honestly, any of these NPCs. The first time I encountered this guitarist, I was caught off guard. It doesn't seem like much, but here's the thing. Past Final Fantasy XIII games had NPC interactions that were limited to either a single line of dialogue or conversations that only provide exposition to the story or side quest. Sometimes the side quest in question isn't even provided by a human. 13.2 did this a little better, but it's not what I'd call an improvement. But Lightning Returns did a good enough job to make the world feel lived in compared to the others. Of course, not everything isn't that great. NPCs have two speeds, casual walking or aggressive sprinting. Certain areas are clear NPC spawn points because there's an abnormally large amount of people on one spot. Not gonna lie, it takes away from the immersion a bit when stuff like this happens. Oh Goddess Cetro, hear my pleas in my time of need. Let the music be the one consistently good part throughout the trilogy's history! Hamazu, Misuta, Suzuki, you don't disappoint! It's difficult for me to choose between this game's music over the others because it's made with thought put into it. Not to disrespect the compositions from past games, because I love them as much as the next guy, but there's two things Lightning Returns soundtrack does right. A majority of the new pieces incorporate music from previous 13 games, but notably from the battle theme of Final Fantasy XIII. There's also one important piece I want to cover, but due to spoilers, I must save it for the story section. If you played the game, you may have an idea what I'm talking about. Trust me, it's worth the wait. Also, since this game has a day-night cycle, the worlds play different songs depending on the location and the time of day. My issue with 13.2's transformative music is somewhat fixed here. Again, the transition between exploration and enemy encounter is kept the same, but everything else around it is better applied here. Take this normal enemy encounter for instance. Okay, big enemy, so what? It ain't the first time we've seen something like this. In fact, the music is only good at best. Fair enough. But watch when I perform a stagger when the enemy reaches a certain amount of remaining HP. Just a little more, and...
Hear the great teaching. Pray to the stars.
All of a sudden, the battle is intensified as the end of the fight is approaching. This is something that 13.2 didn't capitalize on as much, and I'm glad that the devs expanded upon this idea for this game. And as mentioned before, a lot of the music from the past games make a comeback for this game that serve as battle themes or exploration themes.
Everything looks shiny, there's something in your life. How do we have to believe that
What's strange is the omission of a main theme. In other Final Fantasy games, there's always a distinct theme that plays during the title screen. Here, one of the main battle themes is the menu theme. I have no idea why that was missing, and that's probably the only critique I had when it came to music. On the surface, Lightning Returns is an ugly looking game that feels devoid of personality and charm compared to the spectacle of Final Fantasy XIII. However, with the circumstances surrounding the game's development, it never had the chance to look better than the games in the past. So why not focus on making other aspects of the presentation be the best it can be? And they did! Kind of. The world feels lived in, when they work. The music is pretty good, but most likely because the composers essentially made a greatest hits album for the 13 series, which isn't bad, but not what I expected. At least the arrangement of said music is better executed here than in previous titles. So really, the weight of the graphical downgrade is balanced out by the other positives made throughout this section. It ain't great, but it ain't that bad either. Whew, nearly dodged a bullet there. Neat, so, what's next? Oh, that. Both Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XIII-2, while mechanically different, follow the same basic formula that traditional Final Fantasy games in the past achieved. They have a similar party system, the same ATB mechanic, and semi-similar exploration mechanics. What sets them apart is the amount of quality of life changes XIII-2 made in response to 13. Between these two games, there's a clear understanding where the third game may head towards, a more action-oriented take on the Final Fantasy formula. This idea is better represented in the Requiem of the Goddess DLC from the last game, a personal highlight of XIII-2. The only question is, how do you further refine the best version of the 13 combat loop? Simple answer, you throw away everything and start from scratch. What? Nearly every gameplay element established in the first two games are thrown out the window in favor of brand new mechanics. No crystariums, no traditional ATB gauges, and no paradigm shifts. As for the gameplay, it's such a major departure, you'd think twice if this game came from the same series. I'm going to list off a couple of major things just to give you an idea. First and most blatant mechanic, a time limit. Time plays a key role in gameplay, unlike games prior. Lightning in this game is known as the Savior, who must save as many souls as possible in a specified amount of time before Doomsday occurs. On the top right corner of the screen is a clock. After the first day, you'll have 24 in-game hours over the course of 6 days to complete missions, defeat enemies, save souls, discover treasures, and collect gear to be ready for the end of the world. There are ways to gain and lose time. If you escape from a battle on normal difficulty or higher, your position will be reset from before engaging an enemy, but at the cost of 1 in-game hour. If you save enough souls over the course of the game, this tree will reward you with an extra day on the counter for a maximum of 14 total days. I have mixed feelings toward this mechanic. In hindsight, my throwaway line from Saz's DLC in XIII-2 about Chronobind is taken literally. When I first started playing this casino game, I was dumbfounded by the complicated nature of a freaking clock determining the fate of the game. Well, that's some unintentional foreshadowing, but it is true. I don't want to feel like I'm forced to rush through the game. I want to take my time and explore all of Lightning Returns at my own pace. Note to self, don't make a throwaway line without thinking, otherwise there's a 50% chance it will really happen in some form. On the other hand, after giving the time limit mechanic a fair shot, it's not as bad as others make it out to be. On my first run, I was able to complete all main missions and a sizable amount of side quests by the time the game ended, and I was taking my time with missions and failing some enemy encounters on the first couple of in-game days. On my second run, which I'll discuss in detail in a later section, I completed more missions and collected more gear in a shorter time frame. Although, I believe I tolerated the time limit mechanic here because of the second mechanic, energy points. For those who played Final Fantasy XIII, this mechanic is similar to tech points, where players can use abilities like summoning eidolons. Outside of that plus healing, there really isn't much use for the TP mechanic, at least I didn't. In Lightning Returns, it comes back in the form of energy points, or EP for short. As the Savior, Lightning has access to a collection of powers she can use at the cost of EP, such as healing, resurrecting, cleansing, and chronostasis. This is your best friend, and in some cases, your personal savior. Chronostasis is the power that pauses the in-game clock. The world and the people will still move, but time itself has stopped for 1 real-world minute, bypassing the time limit imposed by the game. The total amount can be found on the bottom left corner of the screen. As Lightning grows, she can receive more EP bars and new abilities. I believe this is a better version of the TP mechanic found in the first game, when it was only used to summon instead of other properties. The reason why I didn't mention it as much in my 13 review was because I never had a reason to use this mechanic outside of summons. Here, it's an essential mechanic that's used more times than a priest's Bible. I can't tell you how many times I've used Chronostasis when I wanted to finish a main story with some time to spare in case I failed the battle. This doesn't mean it's overpowered early in the game. Since there's a time limit to how many times one can activate Chronostasis, you'll need to defeat enemies in order to get back some charge. But even that mechanic can be abused to absurdity, which I'll discuss about it soon enough. Hypothetically speaking, if this game didn't include the EP mechanic, I'd miss it. Hell, I'd get down on my knees and beg for a mechanic like it, as it made traversing the world of Lightning Returns more bearable. Third, the method of leveling up. In prior games, the Crystarium is used to level up characters and receive bonuses like HP, Strength, and Magic Boost. To do so, players must defeat enemies found in the world and obtain Crystal Points. Do you know the method Lightning Returns adopts to level up stats? Completing missions! By that, I mean completing main quests, side quests, and quests found on the board provided by 13-2 alumni Chocolina. Completion of these quests will net players strength, magic, and HP boosts, and occasionally accessories, weapons, garbs, money, recovery slots, and EP capacity. The higher the difficulty of missions, the larger the reward is. Be warned, because there are ways to fail a mission and you can't retry specific missions. Defeating enemies won't offer experience points, but instead will reward you with money, item drops, a percentage of EP recovered, and abilities. Yes, you heard that correctly. Even when leveling up, you don't automatically receive new abilities at certain points like previous games. You need to get lucky to receive certain high-level abilities. Okay, I've played a lot of RPGs in my life. Some I played for as little as half an hour, and some as long as over 200 hours. But never in my life have I ever played an RPG where player progression is only tied to completion. This is a strange mechanic, even as far as 13 mechanics go. Early on, I was struggling to defeat bosses in the first few zones. In order to make any progress, the game requires players to travel around the world and complete other side quests and the quest board. Out of all the changes made, this was annoying to deal with, as it feels like a backwards method for typical RPGs. In my mind, I was thinking, what was the point of defeating enemies if they don't even provide experience points? So I avoided them as much as I can. But then, I learned the hard way when realizing certain missions require materials dropped by enemies, so it's time to grind it out. This was seriously outside of my comfort zone, but as soon as I got into the habit of completing a large amount of missions before tackling boss battles, it made the experience more rewarding. Fourth but not final, the schemata mechanic. Before, your party consisted of 3 characters in the first game, and technically 5 in the second game. Both used the paradigm system that allowed characters to switch roles on the fly. Lightning Returns kinda brings that mechanic back, but not really. Throughout the adventure, you play as Lightning and only Lightning, with the occasional helper in specific zones at certain points. Instead, Lightning has access to 3 different loadouts that comprise of a costume, a weapon, a shield, a set of accessories, and 4 different moves players can customize at their discretion, with the exception of certain garbs with locked moves. As different as this edition is, this is the best idea the 13 games implemented. This enables players to fully customize and fine-tune moves at the player's discretion. I can have a schemata that focuses on healing, or ones that prioritize magic damage. Since there's a large list of garbs, weapons, shields, and accessories, the combinations are limited to the player's imagination. This customization isn't limited to gameplay, as costumes themselves can be customized. It's only by adjusting their colors and wearing a collection of adornments, but I appreciate the level of freedom the players have for creating their own gameplay experience. Over the course of the game, players will obtain different equipment through different methods, such as quest rewards and buying them from shops scattered across the world. There are other methods for acquiring new costumes under certain conditions. If you have a save file for 13 and or 13.2, the game rewards you with costumes and equipment inspired by their respective games. Plus, players can simply purchase more costumes that are either original in design or inspired by other Square Enix properties such as Lara Croft from Tomb Raider or Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. For this reason, I won't include a dedicated DLC section for Lightning Returns. Unlike 13.2, this game only contains costumes, a Japanese voice pack, and nothing else. Totally worth it. But what about combat? How does it feel compared to the last 2 games? In an odd twist, it's clearly a different way of playing the game compared to the rest of the trilogy, but it carries the spirit of what made them fun in the first place. Lightning Returns does away with the traditional mechanics that Final Fantasy was known for in favor of a more action-oriented playstyle that isn't too far off from what future Final Fantasy games would be known for today. But unlike its successors, the battlefields are always the same layout, a circular arena that players can slowly navigate around. As mentioned before, gameplay consists of using 3 different schemata and defeating enemies. There is no menu system like the previous games, but instead button commands that can either be mashed or held to continually activate the selected ability. Each schemata has their own ATB gauge, health bar, and recharge rate depending on how you build the schemata. The stagger mechanic has changed a bit from a bar in the top right corner to being represented by wavelengths on top of the enemy. Staggering an enemy is dependent on taking advantage of enemy weaknesses and attacking under certain conditions, instead of using magic to quickly build stagger and physical attacks to keep the stagger from dropping like before. If the changes I listed before didn't make it seem like a different game, then this brand new combat system may turn off some fans of the other 13 games. As someone who loved the combat flow of Requiem of the Goddess, I like it. When everything from the customization to the combat flows together, it feels like an extension from what Requiem of the Goddess introduced. This isn't what I expected as a follow-up to what I considered to be fantastic gameplay, but I welcome it nonetheless. Final Fantasy XIII is infamous for its linear level design in the first 2/3 of the game. It does open up by the final third, but eventually gets you back on track for the final boss in the game. 13.2 does away with strict linear game design and opts for a semi-open world level design with some areas that reward players for exploring. Lightning Returns starts off in a linear path for tutorial purposes and drops you into the open world as soon as the tutorials are finished and completing the first mission. Both Luxurion and Yuznon have level designs that take cues from 13.2's and lets players explore without feeling constrained into one lane all the time. There's even some verticality involved in certain areas, such as the Warrant and Yuznon's industrial area. Both the Wildlands and the Dead Dunes are the most open the series has ever been, but contain more stuff to do and people to talk to, unlike the Dying World in 13.2. It's so large, I didn't get the chance to fully explore the zones in my first playthrough, which default falls on the time limit mechanic rather than the levels themselves. Speaking of size, that folder I mentioned earlier, let's bring back that argument and put it back on the table. You may have noticed, outside of starting the game, playing cutscenes, resting, or teleporting from one zone to another, there are no obvious loading screens. There's no reason to load anything within these zones during gameplay. They're small enough to traverse without hitting a loading screen every 5 minutes. It's nothing special. That is, until you come across a set of quests on the quest board that requires you to either find keys or open gates that lead to other zones. After completing these quests, Lightning can travel between zones without relying on the train or teleporting. Why is this such a big deal? In Lightning Returns, if you reach this point in the game, loading screens aren't as common. Of course, this large world is an illusion because the highway is long enough to warrant hidden load times, but it's able to load in a way that doesn't interrupt normal gameplay. But why would you do that when the train is far more convenient and faster? Well, players would find a highway more convenient than it appears, considering the game's time and progression mechanics. Keep in mind, if you use the train, you'll end up wasting money and up to 1 hour of time that could be better used somewhere else. If you're high leveled and defeat large enemies, you're rewarded with more EP, doubly so if you defeat them in a chaos zone. So hypothetically speaking, you can activate chronostasis indefinitely as you're traveling from one zone to another while saving precious time and money. Plus, certain missions can only be completed by collecting materials dropped by enemies, so running from one zone to another is a better method than running around in circles waiting for a specific monster to spawn in, wasting precious resources. In some respects, these major changes makes Lightning Returns feel less like a traditional JRPG and more like an action RPG that experimented with new ideas. Some clearly needed more time to think through, while others were enjoyable to play and discover. I won't sit here and say that I had fun with the gameplay of Lightning Returns, as I still believe 13.2's gameplay is far better executed. There is a caveat to this statement, however. The amount of time I felt I was having fun playing Lightning Returns over 13.2 is longer than the latter. Keep in mind, I said in my review that 13.2's gameplay is executed better in the Requiem of the Goddess DLC, and I stand by it. That was an experience that lasted for about 2 hours, and while it took some time to get used to the brand new mechanics, my enjoyment level lasted far longer in Lightning Returns than a majority of 13.2's runtime. The combat is different, but carries some elements of what made the past 2 games great. Exploration is not as great, but it is an improvement over 13.2 in some areas. There are some decisions I don't agree with, such as the time mechanic and the progression system, but it didn't impact my enjoyment as much as it supposedly did to others. So really, the gameplay isn't my favorite in the series, but I personally like it more than the first games. Oh boy, it's time to talk about the story! I wonder what level of disappointment we're getting this time around. There is a lot to unpack. In the past two games, the only consistent thing about the story is how it underperformed compared to the rest of their respective games. To quickly recap, Final Fantasy XIII sees Lightning and Co. stand up against the main antagonist Barthandelus and save Serah. 13-2 sees Noel and Serah travel through time, resolve paradoxes, and defeat Caius to save the world, only not to succeed in the end. What we have here is an interesting situation. Now that the goddess Etro is dead, and a paradox is unleashed to the world, what's gonna happen? Can this world be salvaged? Lightning Returns takes place 500 years after the events of 13-2, meaning, if my math is correct, this game takes place about 1,000 years after the first game took place. For a 1,000-year-old woman, Lightning still looks pretty good. The end of the world is approaching, and Lightning, the main protagonist from the first game, is tasked by the god Bunavelza to save as many souls as possible, so God can transfer them into a new world crafted by him. In exchange, Lightning will be able to resurrect her sister Serah, who died in the last game. Well, it's less resurrecting and more like retrieving her lost soul, but you get the idea. I made fun of Lightning in the first game, but admittedly, I always thought she was a badass looking character. So much so, I ended up getting a figure based on her design from Lightning Returns years ago, not because of the game, but because of her growth as a character in 13. At the same time, the problems with Lightning as said character starts to rear its ugly head by the first several hours of the game. Lightning sounds so monotone and tired of everything. It's almost like the voice actors want out of the recording booth ASAP. She sounds emotionless even in scenes where a comedic event happens.
Chocobo, it's time to tell! What are the magic words?
I don't have a choice, do I? Meow, meow, choco chow.
You can head for the surface anytime you want. Just remember though, you have to come back here every morning at 6.
You're giving the savior a curfew. Is that it?
Though that's not to say she can't be funny.
Maybe. Who's going to replace her on such short notice?
You're looking at her.
In the defense of Lightning in this game, there's a narrative reason why 99% of characters, including NPCs, act this way. In 13-2, it's known that Caius succeeded by unleashing a paradox onto the world after Noel technically killed the goddess Etro. Once Etro was no more, people cannot age or die as easily. With the exception of illnesses or accidents, no one can die from old age. Since the paradox affected the livelihood of everyone in this world, the people have grown accustomed to this ageless life for over 500 years, as if it's the new norm. There are those who are used to this new lifestyle, while others are coming to grips with this situation, thinking that this blessing of immortality is a curse. Plus, if the shoe's in the other foot, and you had to deal with saving your sister, leading an army, defeating several deities, and feeling remorseful for sending said sister to her own grave over the course of a millennia, and are then tasked with saving the souls of the living, I think you'd be done with life in general. So, I don't have a real problem with Lightning as a character, given her background. Much like 13-2, all of the original party members from the first game come back, but play a much larger role than the last game, with some feeling the repercussions of the ending of 13-2. In fact, all of the characters are involved in the main missions instead of being regulated to side content or less. Noel is dubbed as the Shadow Hunter and has a vision from an oracle drive that tells him he must kill the savior so he can bring Yule back. Snow became a patron for the city of Yuznan, nicknamed the Boss, and appears to be yearning for death after feeling responsible for his fiance's death. Vanille awoke from crystal stasis after many centuries and became a high priestess for the city of Luxurion. Fang became a leader of a gang of bandits in the Dead Dunes after a falling out with the Order, leaving behind Vanille. And Saz is on a mission to find parts of a soul in order to snap his son, Daj, out of an eternal slumber. All of these characters, compared to their roles in 13-2, are central to the major story of the game. Except Saz. Yeah, his story arc is kind of sad, no mistakes about it, but the devs can cut it from the main game and players won't miss a thing. It doesn't really play into anything other than an excuse to let the audience know that he exists. Seriously, this guy can't catch a break. Well, at least he's treated better than... him.
Now listen carefully, Light. What I'm going to tell you is very important. As the world was lost immediately under the ocean of chaos, I call only one small region the power of God's light. The survivors call their island past the world we built as much. This is where the souls of chaos brought destruction. This red kind of immortality energy to the world. But the people.
Yeah, I don't like him here. All he does is spew exposition as if he's a walking encyclopedia of everything that happened in the past and the present, devoid of a personality unlike games prior. But there is a lore reason why Hope behaves the way he does. It's not exactly spelled out to the player in the beginning, but it's implied that the god Bunavelza has imprinted a bit of himself into Hope in order to monitor whether or not Lightning is doing as she's told, and not have her go back on her word to play the role as the savior.
You need my advice, and in here we can talk about anything we want, safe from prying eyes.
Prying eyes? You mean Hope?
Yep, he might not realize it, but everything he learns gets passed straight on to God.
Hope, in this game, serves as an oracle for Lightning so she can carry out her duty as the savior while he monitors and looks up information on what he should do next. So, he's kind of like Navi from Ocarina of Time, only not as annoying, which is surprising given his performance in 13, but not as enthusiastic. But that's not all of the side characters, as a handful return from previous games such as Chocolina, Yule, Caius, Cid Raines, and even Mog from the last game show up to the party, along with newcomer Lumina. Their roles range from quest givers to boss characters and providing answers to questions such as the link between Yule and the Chaos, and the mystery behind Lumina and what she means to Lightning, plus some insight on who Chocolina really is. I won't spoil who she is exactly, but the only thing I will say about her is this: she's been a part of the trilogy from the beginning. Side quests in the previous 13 games were never the strong point. 13 regulated a majority of the side quests and extra content in the final third of the game, and when side quests are peppered throughout 13-2, they lack the impact necessary for them to stand out. This time around, since completing missions is heavily tied to progression, players will get to experience so much side story content it may as well be a part of the main story. That's a good thing or a bad thing? All depends on what the side quests compose of. Surprisingly, there's more to it than what's presented in the past. In fact, some of the side quest stories are almost as engaging as the main quest story. For context, Final Fantasy XIII's side quests consists of interacting with a Seath Stone, going to a designated area on the map, and defeating a specific monster. No conversations, just a wall of text about a person's failed task given by the Foul Sea, and fulfilling it. 13-2 had NPCs interact with Noel and Sarah, which is an improvement, but the missions only consist of finding items, defeating enemies, and solving puzzles. Not what I'd call engaging stuff. In Lightning Returns, what you do in these side quests are varied. Sure, you still have your fetch quests and bounty targets, but there's also escort missions, committing monster genocide, no, I'm not joking about that one, testing items, and interacting with NPCs in a set schedule. On their own, it's not something that can't be replicated in other RPGs, but combined with story context, it's some of the most engaging side content I've experienced in the 13 trilogy. Take a story about a girl who charges money to cry for others, but not for herself.
People have lived for so long with feelings of sorrow and despair that it's become a natural part of them now. They don't even notice it anymore. They can't cry because they've forgotten how.
Or a small robot that requires fuel in order to save its friends.
I had no idea that they needed constant refueling. They must have thought that I had abandoned them here.
I don't think they did. They would have known that you were doing everything you could to save them.
Even smaller scale missions like a foot race against a boy and finding a doll for a little girl carry some meaning behind it. Those missions carried more sentimental values than less than half of the side quests found in 13-2. Granted, they're not original quests and the messaging can get ham-fisted at times, but I enjoy them more here as it injects a bit of humanity into a world where living forever is the norm and doomsday is fast approaching. They further the player's understanding of the world they inhabit and how these people live and cope with the situation at hand. It's a shame that these quests, for all of their enjoyment, are tied to the time limit, meaning that not everyone will get to experience them the first time around. Throughout the entire game, Lightning meets with a character that is similar in appearance to Sarah, named Lumina. There's an air of mystery surrounding the character and small hints are sprinkled in the game. By the final day, after finishing the main missions, Lightning heads to the church and attempts to stop Vanille from performing a ritual where the souls lost in the chaos will be destroyed, not out of malice, but to release them from their suffering as a form of retribution for things that she did in the past. After fighting against enemies with a little help from her friends, Lightning has managed to stop the ritual, momentarily, until the god himself Bunavelza appears before Lightning and Co. and takes the souls of Vanille, Fang, and Snow. Alone again, Well, not exactly, because Mog appears as a shop and upgrade station. Lightning ventures forth into the final battle against Bunavelza and save all of humanity. Okay, now that I'm at this part of the video, it should be safe for me to talk about the music. The reason why I had to wait this long is because the theme that plays during the final boss fight is not only the best final boss theme in the trilogy, not only is this incorporating past boss themes from the previous games, but it's a culmination of everything the trilogy stands for. Certain pieces from the Final Fantasy XIII games are interwoven into this epic piece, invoking memories of past final bosses. This theme, combined with the gameplay and story significance, makes the battle against Bunavelza a fight to remember. After an admittedly crazy final boss fight, seriously, this is harder than other final bosses from before, Lightning defeats Bunavelza and is transported to a familiar location and is met by Lumina, who reveals to her that she is the personification of repressive vulnerabilities that Lightning rejected. Some would assume that she's related to Sarah due to the heavy resemblance of each other, and I wouldn't blame them for thinking that. After accepting Lumina into her heart, Sarah's soul is free and Lightning's heart is made whole once again. At least, I think it's made whole. I can't tell if— okay. She smiled. We're good. Lightning gathers the power of friendship and the souls of everyone she saved and defeats Bunavelza for good. After which, Lightning and the rest of humanity are transported to a brand new world, which ends up being our world. Oh, I'm not kidding about that. That's what the game is implying.
The Crystal Age is just a legend, from before the world was born. And it ended before you were born.
I have mixed feelings about this ending, to put it simply. This entire sequence feels like a Deus Ex Machina, where a divine being, in this case Lightning, comes and saves the world from destruction from Bunavelza. It feels kind of underwhelming. Although, I can't think of a better ending to the series than this. Truth be told, I believe the series should have ended in the first game because it had a clear beginning, middle, and end. It wasn't great, but it did tie up loose ends. 13-2's story, not gameplay, feels like an unnecessary sequel that was made because other games around this time had trilogies, so what's another one in the pile? But Lightning Return's ending feels warranted, considering what these characters had to go through in the entire sub-series. It's a little over the top, but it was fun to watch Lightning and Co. drill through Bunavelza like in Gurren Lagann. Story was never the strongest suit in the past 13 games. There was the occasional good element such as the mythos in the first game, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't anything special. The developers could have kept the effort on the story at a minimum given the dev time, but they didn't. The story was engaging and the mystery behind characters like Lumina and Yule hooked me through the end. Plus, I was engaged with the side quest stories enough to call this an improvement over the stories of the trilogy. It's not a great story compared to other games in the same genre, but as far as this series is concerned, I consider this to be the biggest strength in the 13 trilogy. Usually, I don't replay games the moment the credits finish rolling. If I did, then I would revisit it sometime in the future, maybe once a year for my personal favorites, but I was so impressed by the gameplay, I wanted to play some more. Through that desire, I have discovered New Game Plus. Now, I want to preface by saying I did not plan to make a segment regarding the New Game Plus mode, but considering what other content is added, I have to at least cover what's in it and what my playstyle is like after playing Lightning Returns a second time. After finishing the first playthrough, players have the choice to play the game again, this time with a few modifiers. Players can choose to play the game on hard, the highest difficulty possible, while retaining the same stats, the same equipment such as weapons, schemata, and accessories, and items like components and recovery items. There's also the added bonus of upgrading weapons and gear in forgeries and collecting certain accessories a second time to improve their stats. As a trade-off, all missions from main quests to side quests and missions from the board will need to be completed again. No extra adornments will be awarded if you already completed the mission the first time around. In terms of story, everything remains the same, only this time, you don't go through the tutorial section, and there's a small aside in the beginning that indicates that this has happened before.
Good to see you again. Is something the matter?
No, it's just... I suddenly had this strange feeling of déjà vu. I could have sworn we've done this before. That we've been in this exact same situation.
I hope you're not imagining things.
Now that I'm playing through the same game again, I was able to clear missions and defeat boss characters at a faster pace than before, meaning that I have time to discover new missions I never got the chance to start and complete previously failed missions. Surprisingly enough, I completed missions so fast I had several extra in-game days to spare. Because of this, after what's supposed to be the final day came, there's an extra day granted by the tree, which Hope explains.
I think it was the XIII that you harvested. Somehow, you accumulated so much that the distortion in the space-time was repaired, and we got back all those missing hours from the last 12 days.
That's 24 we didn't have. Which means we've been given a reprieve one more day before God awakens and the final destruction begins. Just the one day. It's not a lot of time.
Yes, but it's enough for what I want you to do. I detected a previously unknown ruin deep in the Dead Dunes. Its appearance coincided with the return of the lost time.
Your reward for completing enough missions is a challenge called the Ultimate Lair, where Omega versions of previously fought enemies appear. And after all of that, what's the reward for completing the game with a majority of the missions completed through New Game Plus? A post-credit scene where we see Lightning getting off a train in a European town looking for her friends in this brand new world. The adventure is over, and everyone can smile once more. After completing this, I did look up what the unlock conditions are for this ending, and it turns out you only need to unlock the Ultimate Lair on normal or higher. No completion required, but as someone who didn't unlock the feature the first time around, this was a nice bonus to have for completion's sake. And it's more or less how I see this New Game Plus mode. An unnecessary, but rewarding bonus. You don't need to beat the game a second time to fully enjoy what Lightning Returns has to offer. But it's nice that I get to experience this game all over again. Prior to making these reviews about Final Fantasy XIII, I had the preconceived notion that if I was going to play these games, I would have to eventually endure through Lightning Returns. I was debating if I should cover this series or choose a different series like Max Payne or Halo. But not only did I want to experience Final Fantasy XIII through a critical lens, I wanted another excuse to play 13-2 again. So I decided to take on the challenge of reviewing all 3 games and see if there was anything of value to talk about today. At first, I felt betrayed that Lightning Returns threw away everything the sub-series built up in favor of attempting to try something new, when there was little to no reason to do so. But why did I continue to play this game? Is it out of obligation? Not entirely, because what reason do I have is to start a New Game Plus immediately after the credits? Putting aside the game's ugly exterior, once I understood its mechanics and listened to the story with as much attention as possible, Lightning Returns is a well-crafted game that's smarter than what critics initially gave it at the time. The combat takes some getting used to, but experimenting with different playstyles, figuring out the enemy's moves, and traversing the world has been an exhilarating experience. The story isn't going to win any awards or fans for the most part, but compared to previous stories in the past, this was made with thought and care, and it's the best send-off for the 13 trilogy. So, why did I dread playing this game initially, only to fall in love by the end of the second playthrough? Because the name is attached to an infamous game. First impressions are everything, and Final Fantasy XIII didn't exactly win over critics and fans of the franchise. Because of this, the games that followed weren't given a fair shot due to the branding. It would not surprise me at all if that was the true reason why Final Fantasy XV was renamed from Final Fantasy Versus 13. Had Lightning Returns been renamed or reworked as a new IP, it could be seen as a unique twist in the RPG genre. Whether or not it would succeed is a different story. As it is, it's a Final Fantasy game that feels ahead of its time given how much of the mechanics are later used in future Final Fantasy games. In my 13-2 review, I declared that the game was the best of the 13 series. After playing for over 80 hours, I think I'm going to take that crown back. In a twist of fate, Lightning Returns, for all of its faults, has become my favorite game in the 13 trilogy. Mass Effect, Fallout, and The Witcher are all critically acclaimed RPG franchises, considered to be legendary in the eyes of fans and reviewers alike. I've always wanted to at least try them out to understand why people hold a special place for these games in their hearts. Unfortunately, for some of these titles, I never got past the 3-hour mark. But why? It's not because I don't play popular or highly rated games, otherwise titles like Genshin Impact and Red Dead Redemption wouldn't catch my interest. It's not the visuals, because some of these games are beautiful for the time, except Fallout. Not the narrative either. The only logical conclusion is the gameplay. I'm not certain why, but RPGs during the 7th generation, even the popular ones, don't feel good to play all of these years later. However, the more I think about why I felt this way for the acclaimed titles, the more the answer becomes clear. Expectations. I approached these games with the mindset that they would be perfect games from beginning to end. A big mistake on my part, certainly, but when you have everyone and their mothers praise these games like it's the second coming of Christ, who's the one truly at fault for setting these expectations in the first place? It's why I don't trust the word of the people as often, because I'd rather get my hands on the game and judge it on my own terms. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to review the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. For over a decade, I've heard fans declare that the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy is the worst set of games to ever exist in franchise history. Are they really? I mean, I won't pretend to say that they belong in the pantheon of gaming. All 3 of these games aren't objectively terrible, but it's clear that there will be a fan base that will absolutely love them and an opposing force that will despise the trilogy, but not without merit. For every positive I can come up with, there's several negatives I can think of. Final Fantasy XIII's presentation, without contention, is its strongest area, with graphics that could rival some 8th generation games, and some story elements like the mythos and character dynamics being a joy to watch. While the combat is fun to play that lends to some player expression, elements like exploration and discovery are restrictive until the last third of the game. 13.2 attempted to fix most of these mistakes done by its predecessor, and succeeded for the most part. The overall gameplay experience has improved immensely with satisfying combat and some improvements with exploration. It lands between linearity and open world in a comfortable spot. However, the one good thing about the game's presentation is the music, as the visual spectacle found in 13 has been reduced to a minor role, and the story is, to put it simply, wasted potential for something that could have been more than what it is now. To arrive at Lightning Returns, where the presentation is clearly the worst part when considering what came before, but underneath its ugly exterior, there is a fun game to be found, as the gameplay is an evolution of what came before, despite appearances saying otherwise. Dare I say, of the trilogy, the story and the mythos is the strongest of the 3, and is the best conclusion to the 13 series. It's an acquired taste, sure, but those who are willing to put up with its faults would find it to be a blissful experience. For these series of videos, there's a good reason why I split my reviews into 3 central categories. Each game in the 13 trilogy has at least one category it excels at. For 13, it was the presentation. For 13.2, it was the gameplay. For Lightning Returns, the story. If there was a game that combined all 3 of the game's strengths, there's no knowing if it equals success. Only one thing is certain. The DNA of Final Fantasy XIII lives on in other Final Fantasy games all of these years later. The way I see it, the 13 series fell, so 7 Remake can run. While the latter deserves the amount of praise it gets, let's not ignore the contributions the former made to get to where we are. It may not be the best set of games ever made, but I believe the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy deserves a second chance in life. I made the leap, and I've never been happier than ever before. Whether you're new to the channel, a recent subscriber, been with me since the beginning, or since the Misfit Tangent days, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being with me on this journey. These sets of videos weren't easy to make, but I'm proud of how they turned out in the end. If you like these videos, share them around, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe for more videos. I don't know what the future holds, but one thing is certain, I'm glad I was able to make a dream come true. For now,
I need a vacation.
from YouTube. There might be at least one more video to make before the year ends, but no guarantee that it'll be on time. As for Twitch, I'll be streaming whenever I can, but I'm always on Twitter, and I recently made a Discord server so I can engage with you guys. Check them all out in the description below, and as always, this has been Opez Gaming, and have a good one.